Amid rising incidents of internal and external terrorism, as well as escalating aggression between states, the need to spend big on security or defense has never been more important for many African governments. National security is regarded as a government duty, including the security of citizens, the economy, and the country's institutions. Every year, governments allocate a huge budget to fighting battles and protecting their territories. Each country takes different special initiatives in a bid to strengthen itself militarily, including pumping a lot of resources into its defense mechanisms. The portion of the national budget that is allocated to defense covers salaries, training, and healthcare, maintains and purchases arms, equipment, and facilities, funds military operations, and the development of new technologies. So in today's video, we will look at the top 15 African countries with the highest defense budget in 2022. Let's dive right in. 15. Botswana, $473 million. The latest value for military expenditure in Botswana decreased to $473 million in 2022 from $517 million in 2021. Military expenditure in Botswana averaged $224 million from 1977 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $522 million in 2017 and a record low of $5 million in 1977. 14. Ethiopia, $538 million. Perhaps because of its history and location, Ethiopia has traditionally set a high premium on its military institutions. Whether under the monarchy, the socialist regime of Mengistu Haile Mariam, or the liberal semi-democratic regime since 1991, the military has always been central to state planning and external relations, and as a result has demanded a significant share of the state's meager resources. Despite a lack of transparency that is characteristic of military-centered governments, data on the military expenditure of Ethiopia are available even for the socialist period. The military budget in Ethiopia decreased to $487 million in 2021 from $504 million in 2020, but later increased to $538 million in 2022. It is indicated that there is a need to allocate more budget due to the economic pressures in the war-torn areas. 13. Mali, $591 million. Over the past few years, Mali has made modest progress in improving defense and security sector governance. The 2015 Military Programming Law outlines the armed forces' strategic goals and greater budget transparency. Military expenditure in Mali decreased to $558 million in 2021 from $593 million in 2020. Military expenditure in Mali increased to reach $591 million in 2022. The expenditure averaged $99 million from 1961 until 2021, reaching an all-time high of $593 million in 2020 and a record low of $3 million in 1961, growing at an average annual rate of 11.25%. 12. Ivory Coast, $651 million. The Ivory Coast has been experiencing security issues, particularly on its border with Burkina Faso, which has been under increasing attack by jihadist groups since June 2020. These attacks have already claimed the lives of Ivorian defense and security forces. Sharing a border with Burkina Faso, which is one of the hotbeds of terrorism in West Africa, the Ivory Coast has undertaken several initiatives to deal with the growing threat since the attacks of Grand Bassam in 2016. The Ivorian government has increased its defense investment this year, 2022. To address the growing terrorist activity in the country, Ivory Coast has invested $651 million in its defense in 2022. This is $43 million more than the amount invested last year. The 2022 defense expenditure represents about 3% of the total state budget of $17 billion proposed by the government for the year. Military expenditure in Ivory Coast averaged $198 million from 1962 until 2021, reaching an all-time high of $608 million in 2021 and a record low of $8 million in 1963. 11. Tanzania, $749 million. Tanzania has been experiencing security issues. The military has been fighting against attacks from the Ansar al-Sunna wal Jamaa terrorist group, which has been killing people, destroying property, and seizing firearms and ammunition in the region. Military expenditure in Tanzania increased to $742 million in 2021 from $659 million in 2020. The Tanzanian government has increased its defense investment this year, 2022. To address the growing terrorist activity in the country, Tanzania has invested $749 million in its defense in 2022. This is $7 million more than the amount invested last year. Military expenditure in Tanzania averaged $233 million from 1967 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $749 million in 2022 and a record low of $14 million in 1967. Hey, take a break. Go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. That way, you'll be updated anytime we upload interesting videos such as this one. These encourage us to keep feeding with interesting videos. Let's continue. 10. Uganda, $934 million. Uganda has experienced serious political and economic difficulties occasioned by internal political jostling for power by its diverse ethnic and interest groups. The military played a critical role in, and indeed was central to, the long drawn-out crisis. Although there has not been any severe war within Uganda, apart from pockets of insecurity caused by cattle rustlers in the Karamoja region, Uganda has been allocating a sizable amount of money every year to the sector. Military expenditure in Uganda increased to $1 billion in 2021 from $984 million in 2020. The Ugandan government has decreased its defense investment this year, 2022. Uganda invested $934 million in its defense in 2022. Military expenditure in Uganda averaged $198 million from 1962 until 2021, reaching an all-time high of $1 billion in 2021 and a record low of $70 million in 1962. 9. Angola, $1 billion. Angola's history is filled with many challenges, and its survival as a single entity has been threatened since its independence in 1975. The Angolan government has increased its defense investment this year to address the growing security threat in the country. The Angolan government has invested $1 billion in its defense in 2022. Military expenditure in Angola decreased to $981 million in 2021 from $993 million in 2020. The military budget in Angola averaged $1.6 billion from 1978 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $6 billion in 2014 and a record low of $159 million in 1996. The expenditure is set to be valued at $8.5 billion cumulatively from the period of 2022 to 2026. 8. Tunisia, $1.1 billion. Military expenditure in Tunisia has increased to over 2% of the country's GDP in recent years as counterterrorism has become a government priority. The country has been under a state of emergency since 2015 due to continued conflict in neighboring states and increased support for non-state armed actors and extremist groups. Despite this, Tunisia's defense sector faces high corruption risks, largely due to its secretive nature and the difficulties for Tunisian citizens to access information on military spending and equipment. Moving forward, the military expenditure in Tunisia increased to $1.2 billion in 2021 from $1.1 billion in 2020 and decreased to $1.1 billion in 2022. Military expenditure in Tunisia averaged $330 million from 1956 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $1.2 billion in 2021 and a record low of $3 million in 1956. 7. Kenya, $1.1 billion. Kenya is bordered by two insecure countries, South Sudan and Somalia, and there's a need for better border surveillance to secure the porous borders, especially the Somalia-Kenya border. Kenya is taking a mega step in equipping her forces with modern equipment that will help in fighting domestic and external terrorism, human and drug trafficking, armed smuggling, and insurgencies. The border between Kenya and Somalia, especially because it is a weak link that lets the flow of the al-Shabaab militants from Somalia into the country. Kenya's new president, William Ruto, has dispatched Kenyan defense forces to the east of the DRC to fight the M23 rebels. In 2022, Kenya allocated $1.1 billion to its defense as the country sought to modernize its hardware. Kenya has acquired helicopters, unmanned aerial vehicles, armored vehicles, border surveillance, and monitoring equipment. The modern equipment are to strengthen her security at the coast, her territorial waters, and her land to curb illegal activities that jeopardize her security. This move will place Kenya in a level or better position in fighting any security threat targeted at her. The move is driven by the fact that the Kenyan coast is used as a transit point for international human traffickers to transport people, and especially women, from Africa and Asia to Europe and other parts of the world. Military expenditure in Kenya increased from $22 million in 1971 to $1.1 billion in 2022, growing at an average annual rate of 11.3%. 6. South Africa, $2.9 billion. Since South Africa is the most advanced economy on the African continent, it has one of the most powerful militaries in the world. But analysts have warned that the country's military is in a state of critical decline. Since the Namibian War of Independence ended, military expenditure in South Africa experienced a sustained period of decline. The Defense Ministry and military leaders have lamented the debilitating cuts to its budget over the years. The South African defense budget for 2022 has marginally decreased from the previous year's adjusted allocation of $3.2 billion to $2.9 billion. Military expenditure in South Africa averaged $2.1 billion from 1951 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $4.5 billion in 2011 and a record low of $60 million in 1959. 5. Libya, $3.4 billion. The polarization in Libyan politics and the subsequent fighting between rival militias has created a security vacuum in the country that has allowed crime and terrorism to proliferate. Although such security risks are likely to remain elevated over at least the medium term, there is now some scope for improvement. The ceasefire agreement in place provides the possibility of greater political stability. This would have ripple effects throughout Libya's defense sector. Economic growth and a lifting of the UN arms embargo would spur the development of the local defense industry and open up opportunities for defense trade with other states. However, Libya is ranked in the top 5 African countries with the highest military budget of $3.4 billion in 2022. Military expenditure in Libya averaged $900 million from 1959 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $3.9 billion in 2013 and a record low of $5 million in 1960. 4. Egypt, $4.3 billion. Egypt has one of the largest military forces in the Middle East and North Africa and the largest inventory of major weapons in the region. Egypt plays a pivotal role in the security of the Middle East as the doorway to Europe, and its military expenditure reflects its involvement in the machinations of such an unstable region. Military spending in Egypt has seen marked changes that have passed through different phases of decline and increase. Being the major Arab country that confronted Israel since its foundation in 1948, Egypt has allocated a sizable portion of its scarce resources to accumulate weapons and maintain its military forces, along with its neighbors. Amid a growing perception of intensified domestic and regional security threats, Egypt, under President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, has made considerable investments to modernize and train its armed forces. In 2022, the military expenditure in Egypt decreased to $4.3 billion from $5.1 billion in 2021. Military expenditure in Egypt averaged $2.6 billion from 1962 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $5.4 billion in 2015 and a record low of $249 million in 1962. 3. Morocco, $5.4 billion. In the past few years, Morocco has pushed massive military modernization programs with the acquisition of new helicopters, fighter jets, missile systems, and air defense systems. Moroccan defense spending has increased from a $3.5 billion budget in 2018 to a peak of $5.4 billion in 2022, reflecting a compound annual growth rate of 3.2% as the country doubles up the importation of arms and ammunition. The Moroccan government is expected to procure transport aircraft, multi-role fighters, submarines, missile defense systems, and armored vehicles, among others. Additionally, opportunities in security systems and platforms, such as military networking, wireless systems, motion sensors, alarms, and radar systems, are expected to arise as a result of the country's focus on strengthening border security. Military expenditure in Morocco increased to $5.3 billion in 2021 from $4.8 billion in 2020. Its defense budget averaged $1.3 billion from 1956 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $5.4 billion in 2022 and a record low of $23 million in 1956. 2. Nigeria, $5.8 billion. Nigeria's defense budget has risen by 262% in the past 5 years, from $1.7 billion in 2017 to $4.5 billion in 2021 and $5.8 billion in 2022. Despite this increase, Nigerians hold the view that their national security architecture is not as effective as it ought to be. This is due to the very tangible and discernible realities. Insurgency, pervasive militancy, kidnapping, piracy, banditry, farmer clashes, armed robbery, ritual killings, cultism, rape, and huge numbers of internally displaced persons. While this seems to be true due to the current insecurity challenges spread across the country, huge resource allocations to the defense sector have over the years been devoted by both the federal and state governments to enhance security and fulfill their statutory responsibility to protect Nigerian lives. Military expenditure in Nigeria increased to $4.5 billion in 2021 from $2.5 billion in 2020. The country's military budget averaged $1.2 billion from 1960 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $5.8 billion in 2022 and a record low of $23 million in 1960. While military spending alone won't be enough for Nigeria to win the fight against insurgencies, the protection of citizens' life and property is the first responsibility of any government in a democratic society. And the Nigerian government is showing this in its defense budget allocation. 1. Algeria, $9.7 billion. For some years, Algerian military expenditure has been at a very high level. The defense budget is the highest in the region, and there are many reasons for this. First, Algeria experienced a real tragedy in the 90s because of the Islamist insurrection. A war that lasted almost 10 years and caused immeasurable damage to the economy and considerable human loss. There was a serious need to equip and rebuild the army after the war. Secondly, the unstable and explosive geopolitical context in the region. It is true that Algeria is truly surrounded by hotbeds of tension. To the east, there is instability and war between militias in Libya. In the south, Mali is confronted with Islamist and Tuareg guerrillas. In the southeast, Niger suffers the pangs of drought and famine. To the west, there is Morocco, with which Algeria has had tumultuous relations since independence. Algeria had to equip itself with an effective army, well equipped to secure more than 7,000 kilometers of border with its neighbors. To do this, the expenses must be substantial. The military expenditure in Algeria increased to $9.7 billion in 2022 from $9.1 billion in 2021. Military expenditure in Algeria averaged $3 billion from 1963 until 2022, reaching an all-time high of $10.4 billion in 2015 and a record low of $66 million in 1963. Economic progress is nearly impossible in a state of insecurity. That is why it's important for countries to secure their borders and territories. And one of the surest ways to do that is by spending big on the purchase of arms and security equipment, construction of military facilities and technology, as well as recruitment, remuneration, and training of security personnel. While every country in Africa does have its defense budget, some understandably spend more. What are your thoughts on the defense budget in Africa? Let us know in the comments. Like our video if you enjoyed it. Also, if you are really interested in knowing more about Africa, then subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon to get notified when we upload new educative content like this. Thank you for watching and see you in our next video.